Could this be the best value 85mm E-mount lens you can buy? Today we are looking at the new Sirui Aurora full frame 85mm 1.4 lens. This is, I think, a new entry into the world of full frames for Sirui. They've obviously done a lot of Super 35 lenses in the past and a lot of cine lenses, but I think this might be their first full frame autofocus lens that they have released, and I'm sure will be part of a new Aurora series. So how is it? How good is this particular lens? Now, before we get started, Sirui did send me this lens to test and review, and this is a pre-production model. However, they have no say in this video whatsoever. I've only had it a couple of weeks, and in that time, I've actually been away shooting abroad in Dubai, where I did use the lens, so I've been used on an actual proper shoot. However, it didn't really give me a chance to fully kind of go in depth with testing it because I had too many other things to worry about. So don't take this as a full review. This is definitely more of a preview and just an overview and initial impressions of how I feel about this lens. So I have to say, the build quality and overall design of this lens is excellent. Considering the price, it's $499, so it's a very affordable 85mm 1.4 lens. But despite that, the build is excellent. It's fully metal design, it's got nice smooth focus and aperture rings. You even have the option to click or declick the aperture as well. Something you see on more expensive lenses, but it's great to see it here on a budget lens. On the other side of the lens, we have our autofocus switch, which is nice to see that they've included. Some of the cheaper lenses out there just don't bother including them, and I think it's just nice to have that on the lens itself. Yeah, you can do it via the camera menu or setting a button, but I find when I'm switching between manual and autofocus, I do prefer using the switch on the lens itself, and there's even a dedicated button there that you can assign in the camera. Now, one interesting thing about this lens is it has quite a long focus throw, and it seems to be quite a linear focus throw as well. What I mean by that is, even though this is focused by wire, it seems that you can repeat the focus quite easily time and time again. That's not always the case when using a focus by wire lens. Often you'll find that as you adjust the focus and you try and go back to that focus point, suddenly it's not going to be the same as before. But that doesn't seem to be the case with this lens right here. Now, the focus throw is very long, and for a lot of people, they might find that quite frustrating. Certainly, if you're trying to do a focus rack, it's going to be challenging with this lens. However, for some people, the long focal throw could be a good thing. For myself, when I'm shooting details, and that's how I've mostly been using this lens, having the long focal length actually is a bit of an advantage because it means you can get precise focus. When you're trying to focus in on something that's relatively close, it can be very difficult to get your focusing right, or if you adjust the focus slightly, suddenly it jumps if you have a short focal throw. That's not the case with this lens. You can actually get really quite precise manual focusing when you're trying to dial in on something, which I think when you're on this long focal length and at a shallow depth of field can be quite important indeed. Now, the quality of this lens and the image that you're getting out of it, from what I've seen so far, is impressive. I've used it a lot already on the FX3, and I've also tried it on this A7 IV as well, as you can see with some of the shots here. Overall, the sharpness seems to be great. I have no complaints with the image that it can produce. In the corners at 1.4, it is a little bit softer, and you may have a little bit of fringing going on, but it seems like if you stop down 2.8, 5.6 especially, then it is tack sharp across the board. The autofocus is wonderful as well. It seems to snap on and lock no problem, like pretty much any E-mount lens nowadays. I think we're kind of getting past the days of dodgy autofocus lenses. I did have an issue where it would disconnect from the camera when I initially got the lens, but there was a firmware update that fixed that, so I believe that was just probably a pre-production bug that had to be sorted out, and they quickly were able to fix it for me. From what I've seen, I think when you're at 1.4, it perhaps does slightly wash out the image. It's not quite as contrasty as when you're stopping down, and that's just common when you see a lot of these sort of lenses, especially when wide open. And when it comes to flaring, equally, I think it's quite a pleasant flare. It does flare a little bit more than perhaps some of the competition, but for me, I quite like that. I think if I'm using an 85 lens, I want a bit of flare going on, but it does include quite a large lens hood, which can block out a lot of that light. So if you have an issue with flare, then just stick that on the front. The only thing that I wish could be better with this lens, to be honest, is the close focusing. It really can't focus that tightly. Like a lot of 85mm lenses, they generally can only focus to quite far away, and any sort of macro work isn't going to be possible with this lens unless you start using some sort of diopter. Now that is a bit of a shame, because we do have that cheap Canon RF lens which can focus very closely, and I wish that this was able to do that as well. However, I think that's probably an exception to the rule. Generally 85mm lenses don't have the greatest short focusing, and this is no different than a lot of the competition. Speaking of that competition, well, there are a lot of options you could go for in the 85mm world. Of course, you could spend a lot more money and go for a G Master. You are of course going to spend a fortune if you go for one of those lenses. It's going to tick all the boxes. It's going to be the best of the best, but it's also going to be a lot heavier. And I think that would be one big negative I would feel about going for a G Master over one of these. This balances really nicely in the hand, you know, when paired with something like an A7 IV. It's not too heavy. You can easily walk around with this lens and it doesn't take up too much room in your bag. And actually, I think if you were just traveling with something like this and you just wanted to capture nice long lens shots around a city or something, I'd much prefer using this lens over a G Master. If you want to go for something from Sony, then of course there is the 1.8. You're losing a bit of light compared to 1.4, but not too much, not too bad, and actually it's very similarly priced to this lens. I do own one of those lenses, although don't have it on me here. My colleague is using it right now, and that is a great lens. It is a bit more basic in terms of function and features. It doesn't have things like the aperture ring, so it's not as nice to use for video personally. But if you're just doing for photography, then that might not be a problem. If you want ultimate sharpness, then of course there is Sigma, but those lenses are going to be very heavy indeed, and you're going to be paying about twice the price. In terms of the closest competition to this lens, well, I guess there's the Samyang 85mm 1.4, not a lens I have used, but it is very similarly priced. And also there is that Viltrox 1.8 as well that you might want to consider when picking one of these up. So who do I think this would be good for? Well, for me, I'm using it for details, shots of people, things like that. That's where I'm going to be using this lens a lot. Of course, 1.4 means you can get into nice low light situations, but it's more really about creating that depth of field. It's about creating layers and using the shallow depth of field to your advantage, or even just blowing something out in the background. I think that's where it's great for doing with interviews, where perhaps you have an ugly office space that just doesn't look good. And actually 85 on a full frame camera, I think is ideal for interviews. It looks really nice. If I'm using a crop sensor, then personally 85 is a little bit too tight for me in an interview situation. I'd rather go for a 50mm instead. But certainly if you're shooting full frame, like the A7 IV in an interview situation or a FX3, then I would say an 85 is a very nice option to go with, especially if you can pick one up for an affordable price like this. Who's this lens not for? Well, if you can afford G Masters and you don't mind the extra weight, then of course go for those. You know, if you already have a big set of expensive lenses, you're probably not going to want to chuck one of these in as part of it. But then if that's the case, you're probably not considered one of these lenses anyway. The other thing you may be put off is the fact that they only have this one lens in this lineup so far. I'm sure they're going to release far more in this set. I'm sure there will be every focal length you can think of, and I'm sure they're going to be all great and they'll match nicely. But for now, this is the only lens that they have released in the Aura set. So if you are looking to build a set of lenses, then you may have to wait to see what else they might release. And that could be frustrating if you want a matching set. And if that's the case, there are other lens options out there that you can go for. So there you go, that is my brief review of the Sirui 85mm 1.4 lens, their new full frame lens, which I have to say I am very impressed with. I love the size, I love how affordable it is, and the quality is also great. It's really hard nowadays to be negative about lenses like these, because these are just awesome. It's amazing the value you get for the price that you pay. You get so much good quality, great image quality, great build quality. Everything is pretty much perfect, and it's really hard to find any negatives with a lens like this. Certainly if you're looking out for an affordable 85mm lens that goes down to 1.4, well, you'd be pretty happy going with one of these. And if you do want to pick one up, then please use my affiliate link down below, as it massively helps out my channel. And also, while you're down there, make sure you like and subscribe as well. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed this, why not check out my review of the TAMRON 35-150, which I think might be the ultimate B-roll lens.